Okay, we are recording.
Okay.
And so throughout all of the conversations that we've had, it feels like with the pandemic and with some of the stuff that's been surfacing, there's been some big themes. And I feel like from a psychological angle, a lot of it is around collective and individual trauma. How that plays out, why that plays out. You know, we've talked about that in terms of karma. We've talked about it in terms of, you know, you and I have been talking earlier in the week about Peter Levine's work came up and was sort of articulating some of the things that we were talking about really well. And one of the things that he brought up was that trauma is a what did he call it? It's a disorder of not being in the present.
Mm-hmm.
And anyway, he has a lot of interesting conversation about it. So maybe we can just open up, because we're all experiencing individual and collective trauma right now,
Mm-hmm.
in a way. It's sort of this common thread. And I think it also points to sort of a higher unfolding and an elevation of the collective conscious potentially. So maybe let's start with just your perspective of trauma, and I feel like we can loop it back around to everything we've been discussing.
Okay, well, I have two thoughts. One of them was I thought about doing a guided meditation, and I don't know whether to do that early or not do it all, or do it later. You can think about it for a minute. Yeah, I just recently I've been just so aware because I work with so many people with trauma. I work with people with addiction, which means that they found something to try to soothe traumas from the past, or try to avoid them, or try to make them tolerable to cope with. And there's definitely people that have told me that were alcoholics or drug addicts, heroin addicts, that actually the truth was that at the time that they were doing heroin was so bad, or they were drinking so heavily, that if they hadn't had the booze or the drugs to keep them numbed out somewhat, they probably would have killed themselves because the pain was unbearable. So, you know, what we look at as a disgrace or a lack of willpower and, you know, integrity or moral fiber, may be an unconscious attempt to just try to find some way to get some relief so that you want to stay on the planet. And so I was thinking about that, and, you know, it's just, I'm fascinated by the things we've been talking about earlier, which are primarily psychological with some spiritual essence to it. And is how I think about it. And so we have to operate with egos. And if we have egos, then we're talking about psychology. Because egos are around who we think we are. And whether we like ourselves, hate ourselves, want everybody else to like us, think everybody else hates us, whatever we're making up, it doesn't matter. It's usually influenced by trauma and genetics, and or life interpretations as you go along. So when you're in your mother's womb and your dad is drunk and kicking your mother in the stomach, trying to get her to abort, the impression you might have is that there's something wrong with you if you're that fetus. So that's kind of a dramatic example, but I've heard it on both sides of the mother as well as the child who had the experience of feeling this kind of a trauma and abuse coming through the mother's body, and the attitude and wish, maybe even sometimes from the mother, just so that this guy would kicking the crap out of her, that she didn't exist, it didn't matter. And so, at least for me, you start these impressions, the abuse can start as early as when you were conceived. And I know people that I've worked with in the past. I have a process that I do that I learned from this Australian psychiatrist. And basically it has to do with bringing the sperm and the egg together, having the egg bring the sperm into the egg, then the sperm explodes, And at that moment, some kind of spark of life people will experience that, to me, is that essence of God or the essence of the Creator that comes into life force, that comes into everything that's on the planet that's alive. And then impressions start. So the when the sperm explodes, all of the DNA comes through that explosion. So your nose, your ears, your eyes, your body, your bones, all the stuff that is going to fully develop at some point, all started with this DNA and RNA that got exploded into each first cell, and then cells start to divide. Now, I've had people that I've worked with who, as soon as the mother was aware that they'd gotten pregnant, immediately either tried or wished they could kill the child because it was going to mess with their figure, or that they were depressed and they couldn't handle one more kid, or that you were the result of an affair or a rape or a molestation or some other variation, or just the fact you weren't ready. You wanted to go to law school, you wanted to go to medical school, and it wasn't time to have a baby. But immediately the child gets the impression that first earlier cellular memories of experience in the womb, genetics influence, and then the internal messages that are coming through the body and through the frequency and the attitude and mood of the mother's body are that I wish you were dead. So you can see that you might have some sense of trauma from that might make an impression on you in the cellular level, because these cells do have memories, is my opinion. And you can see how that might affect whether you think you're lovable, whether you think you're worthwhile. And so when you come out into the world, if that gets reinforced because the mother didn't want you and she doesn't want to put time and energy into it, or she doesn't know how to relate to you, or your father is mad because she got pregnant and had a baby and it wasn't a boy or a girl, depending on what sex was the right one. Then I've had one time a person that their parents, as soon as they saw that she had a vagina, the father packed up the mother and they took a world cruise and didn't come back for a year because they were so upset. So that could be one way. So abandonment could be the feeling, or it could be somebody just gets treated really poorly over that period. Anyway, all of these things are the foundation of our abilities to have relationships, have connections, feel safe on the planet Earth, whether we're codependent. So, hey, this little infant that wasn't wanted, maybe he or she comes out of his mother or her mother and thinks that I better figure out how to take care of my mom or whatever is needed, or I probably shouldn't have any needs that need to be addressed. So I'm going to try to be needless or wantless, or I'm going to try to please everybody and be the perfect child, be quiet, not let anybody know I'm even here because I don't want to take up any space. All of those things rooted there come out and get played in all these things we've been talking about with relationships. And unless you go back and have a sense of that or willing to do that, if you're having a lot of difficulties, you may not be able to understand that this came from a place that had nothing to do with you. So the fact that you were conceived in a body that didn't want you or that did want you, excuse me, is going to make an impression of whether you're valuable or not, and whether you carry that seed, and whether you take that with you. So it'll be easier for you to have valuable relationships, to feel valuable in relationships, to feel relational with other people if you have this early experience that I matter, I'm worthwhile, I'm important. But this doesn't have to be done perfectly, but just some things are just so extreme that they really throw little beings off and they really get distorted perceptions of who they think they are. So maybe I become a codependent. Maybe my mother is full of pain and fear. So I get the message that if I'm going to live, this woman want to be dead. And if I'm going to survive with this woman, I better figure out how to take care of her fear and pain, because that's my job. And so my codependency began as soon as I came out, or maybe started in the womb, with an impression that my only purpose here was to take care of this person that I was inside of. So this is kind of convoluted, and it it's one level, what's the difference does it make at this point? But the difference it makes, if you have a deeply imprinted belief system that you're not lovable, then, and you go into relationships and you look for somebody to love you, if they love you, you won't take it because you don't think you deserve it. Until you clear that up and become aware that there was nothing wrong with you and you just had an impression. So you can have all the people in the world telling you how much they love you, 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 love you. If it tries to go into the core of your being, it will not be received because it will be considered to be wrong, or that you don't know, or you're lying to me. And if you really knew me, you couldn't possibly love me. And I've worked with people who that was their experience. So then they can get with somebody who's not available. So then you don't have to worry about having somebody love you that you got to turn away. You just spend all your time trying to chase somebody. You're never going to get the person to stand there and love you. So you can spend all your time thinking that if you only caught so-and-so, then you'd finally feel loved. But the truth is, at the core, says, wait a minute, you're not lovable, so forget it. And these things become played out over and over again. And then we look for evidence. So we have an early impression inside the womb, say, that we're not lovable, that we're not worthwhile. Then we will come out of our mothers, come into the world, and we will look for evidence to support what we believe to be true. Because the unconscious wants to survive, and the conscious mind believes these stories at an impression level about ourselves, so that if somebody doesn't reject us, we will reject ourselves. So that's what, to me, the core, where these, and that, again, we were talking about, cultural differences. So say you have a whole culture of which the whole country feels ashamed, and, Germany's an easy example to use because it's loaded with young people that feel ashamed about how their country and the identification with their country or their people, or maybe their parents, ended up treating a large number of people as dehumanized pieces of waste. And the guilt with that, or the guilt of the people who survived the concentration camps, have carried guilt and pain and suffering for those who did die. And why did I get to live and they had to die? Mm-hmm. So it's quite deep, it's quite profound. And looking at this from the point of view that I do, is that the only thing I really can do is to work on my consciousness, my ability to be present and to be available, and to share that energetically as much as I can. And maybe that will help some others pick up on that frequency, and maybe it could be absorbed at the subtle levels. And then there's people that we were talking about Peter Levine going to the Middle East and working with large groups of people, attempting to create a wave of acceptance and love and value that they don't feel in their lives. But if you go deep enough, you always find, if you get to that core of essence, that you are divine in nature, that you are a gift from God, that life is a gift. And we're given complete, total free will to do whatever we want with it, except that we got these heavy influences of genetics and life experiences and interpretations. So that's what I see as a foundation.
Yeah. So I'm hearing, experiences of individual, circumstances, and then sort of the result, how that plays out in life. And there's a couple of things, just listening to Peter, that I want to bring up. Like going back to the concentration camps, and just sort of also identifying trauma, the function of trauma, the definition, the function of it being something along the lines of, like he was talking about, or one of the guys in that talk was talking about if an individual was processing the sort of the heaviness of this collective trauma, they would be like sort of psychotic. So like the point
Mhm.
or what happens with trauma is that it becomes a suppressed
Right.
aspect.
Mhm.
And then what I see and what has sort of been circling under all the conversations is that that trauma becomes part of an unconscious aspect of the self,
Yes.
and that the unconscious aspects, when something is in you that's unconscious, it starts to run the show. It becomes something that you lose your free will around.
Yes.
And I see it as like the unconscious is constantly recreating itself situationally to be seen.
Yes.
And until we have the tools, and I feel like this is also the educational piece that I feel like is really missing from our early childhood development and education process,
Right. Right.
of how to take the somatic triggers and to triggers, to reduce it to the somatic energies, to bring that back to a sort of glimpse of the original trauma, to then integrate it into the intellectual body as well, so that you can kind of close that circle of that kind of. And until you do that, it's just this like it's this unconscious thing that's running the show in some ways,
Of course.
and it was really beautiful the way that man said, I forget his name, but he was saying that unprocessed trauma was sort of your destiny, right, in that
Mhm.
way, because
Yeah. Yeah.
it's living in this unconscious place. And so for me, when I think about it from a higher level perspective, it
Mhm.
again comes back to this: what is it about myself that I'm rejecting or creating a judgment about?
Mhm.
It's coming to the surface in all of my reflections, with my relationships, with my work, with my whatever it is I'm
Mhm.
projecting onto,
Mhm. Mhm. Yep.
and to be integrated and to kind of close that loop so that you can become a fully integrated human being, which
Mhm.
brings you into a place of being present. And one of the things that I've noticed about the way that you work with people that I think is really impactful is the breath work, because I think if you can bring people to the present, you can transcend their traumas and their karma,
Yes.
whatever you want to call it. So the breath work and the meditation, and so medically bringing people to the present moment, is a way
Yep.
of sort of bypassing, you know, in some ways, at least in that present moment. And,
Mhm.
and still, when you go back into your world, you're still going to be presented with any kind of subconscious traumas or energies that want to be resolved. But
Actually.
I think teaching those tools, and then one of the other things I've noticed that you do is you will bring people inward to almost like a psychic energy. You'll have them do visualizations within themselves,
Mhm.
and this kind of intuitive process. So like what I noticed that you'll do with me is, like, when I'm triggered, you'll take me into my body, you'll have me observe it. I can come up with some kind of symbolic representation in my mind, right? And that's what, like, Peter was talking about, that like intuition is this kind of interface between experience and the intellect. And then I feel
Yes.
like that's kind of what you're doing, is you're taking this kind of body experience and then combining it with this kind of intellectual tools to then again kind of close the loop on it, um,
Mhm.
and integrate it. And it's really about, like, for me, it's about like observing, honoring, acknowledging it without the judgments. The
Yes.
judgment piece seems to be a big piece of the resistance that's created.
Yes.
Um,
Yes.
and yeah, so for me, this pandemic is really this has really been this common theme for me, for shedding the old stories, the old karmas, the old traumas surfacing in our
Mhm.
interpersonal relationships, and just being with ourselves. And what it does is it brings us to a life that we are choosing to create, instead of it creating it for us.
Yes.
Like the ultimate invitation to liberation, as far as when we can start to clear our major traumas, we can actually start to create consciously and move forward from a conscious place
Yes.
and create the lives we want, instead of the traumas creating the life for us to deal with.
Yes. Yes. Because the purpose of the unconscious, its number one purpose, is to help you survive. And it figures that if you're still here at that particular moment, it's done its job, and it does not it's not ready or does not like to have you change
Right.
because it's afraid that maybe this is going to interfere with your ability to survive.
Yes.
So if you smoke 5 packs of cigarettes a day, and that's how you've been doing for some period of time, your unconscious thinks, we don't want to stop those cigarettes because we don't know if we'll survive without them. And then we are surviving, so we've done our job, so please don't mess with our job. So it's why the unconscious is so sometimes challenging, why it feels so threatened when you attempt to do some things new and different, and why it's so scary is that at one level, the survival thinks, or the unconscious goes to, we're not going to survive. And then people get so scared that they're going to die trying to change, is that they don't understand. It's just the unconscious that's frightened. The intellect and what you're learning can be what you're working with and saying, hey, I know I'm scared about this, but if I step past what my unconscious is telling me, which is we can't do anything new because we might not survive, and I take the step anyhow and find out if we survive, then the unconscious relaxes very quickly because it knows that, wait a minute, and it tests it out for a while. It might try to pull you back to the old habits. But if you stay with it, eventually the unconscious is, finally, okay, I see that we're gonna be okay. So its need to pull you back to old habits, whether it's an addiction, relationship, whatever, tends to be lessened, or it tends to be a little easier not to go there because the unconscious isn't quite so committed to its fear around survival. Because you've proven through example and time that, wait a minute, we could survive not smoking at all. Oh my gosh, okay. And after a while, the body says, okay, we get it. And this new way of life, these new habit patterns, these new things that become eventually unconscious, and you don't think about not smoking because you just don't smoke. You're not a smoker.
Mm-hmm.
And then it's become, again, one of your unconscious. So you have unconscious. You just want to be really clear and have enough consciousness as possible so that you know that this is an unconscious pattern. Is it really one I want to keep, or would it be better for me to disregard it or weed it out, if you will? And so maybe some other patterns could be put in place
Mm-hmm.
that allow me to have some unconsciousness that allows me to do the best for myself, to bring the most joy to myself, the most satisfaction to myself. And it makes it a whole lot easier to be present if I'm not fighting against all this pain and suffering that I'm avoiding by, trying to survive with my unconscious in charge.
Yeah. Yeah, there was something that was said about creating an environment that was important too, and I think that's also an internal mental environment.
Yes.
Because I don't think you can do the healing if you're still in a place of judgment. I find that the healing happens when you just acknowledge what's happening.
Yes.
Right? And then so there's something about
And think about how much easier it is to let go of something that doesn't have a charge on it.
right.
It doesn't have any value because you're just noticing it.
Well, it's caught in the resistance, and so the allowance or the observation. So this concept of environment, and then also the concept of collective, the collective sort of conscious, collective psychology, collective healing,
Mm-hmm.
and how our own kind of personal healing really can be a radiation of collective healing. And that this is that, and that that our traumas are also shared.
Yes.
Right. One of the things that he was saying was that, the one thing that we all have in common is
Mm-hmm.
trauma. It's the one thing that connects us all.
Mm-hmm.
And there's something about humans and connection. And there's something about human connection through trauma that's really fascinating to me.
Yeah. Yep.
And really deep. Like trauma bonding seems to be this very interesting, like almost like the more trauma we go through with someone, the deeper connection.
Well, you get that connection and you have more energy attachment. But again, those are on one level. If you go to the next level, okay, trauma bonds us. But the truth is, if we go to the next level, which we are everything, we're connected to the source, then we are part of everything. And then there is no separation. there's nothing to be traumatized by because there is no difference.
Right.
And so there is it's not to say you can live there, because nothing really can be done at that level. If you're just going to be in the consciousness of nothingness and everything, it's hard to get much done. So you move into the subtleties of the ego and, like in this case, trauma, but they become some really strong bonds. And they become life-threatening if you try to let go of them, and it gets scary. But the beautiful thing is that when you start to let go of those traumas, and those around you get the benefit of that as well, because you're letting go of the trauma, then they go, oh my gosh, we're going to lose this relationship. You're not going to love me anymore. You're going to leave me. You're not going to care about me anymore. And if the person is interested in being with you, then they can gradually let go of that connection that they had at the trauma level to bring up something that might be of more satisfaction and cooperativeness that actually is richer. It's just not as extreme. It's just not as dramatic. And emotions like drama, so they like to feel like they're important. And so you have the drama stuff. So you get trauma. There's all kinds of trauma bonding that people have that allow them to keep acting out the same thing, because it's a feeling of connection that was significant, even though it was miserable.
Right. Well, I see a collective trauma of the emotional body and a collective suppression of the emotional body because of that collective
Yep.
trauma. And so
Yep.
I see a lot of the social issues that we have, like drinking or a love addiction or sex addiction or whatever it is, that connection, that sort of striving for connection in different ways is
Yep.
sort of the emotional suppressed collective trauma that's asking. And it's like you were saying about the heroin addicts, where I feel like with drugs and alcohol, it's this sort of desperateness to connect, to feel, because we've numbed ourselves and
Right.
we've intellectualized ourselves, and we've sort of created these machines out of ourselves, like we've talked about before, that,
Mhm.
that this suppressed energy is running the show and asking to integrate it, and it's saying, I want to feel connected. I want to feel pleasure. I want to integrate these sort of rejected aspects of our animal body and things that religious, cultures have sort of, judged and suppressed. So I feel like it's all this sort of, whatever the suppressed energy is, it's creating all the codependency dynamics, the addiction dynamics.
Mhm.
Um, and I think this little cocoon time that we've been in has been an individual and collective surfacing of the emotional body. And when I think when that first opens, I mean, I sense and see in my peripheral just a tremendous amount of suffering happening right
Mhm.
now, and this amazing invitation to go from like that sort of separate, ego isolated state to sort of being desperate enough to being open to a well-being that's sort of broader, and more connected and with a bigger perspective. One of the things that has been helping me sort of cope with sort of the perspective of what we're going through, I've just been listening to some kind of more spiritual stuff around when people come here and they're like, I was listening to one about pandemics, and I don't want to get too far into this because this could steer people completely away from psychological conversation, but
Mhm.
they were talking about when at a soul level, when we come here, pandemics and these sort of mass death experiences are these sort of collective conscious agreements or understandings that are going to take us to another shift of the conscious or another evolution of the conscious. And like we talked about with the dualities, like kind of the more extreme dualistic sort of contrast that we experience, we also get this sort of appreciation of value of family and, where are we putting our energy, where are we putting our time? We get these sort of, we get this full dramatic sort of shift in the consciousness when we get these really extreme situations. And so anyway, I was just listening to somebody talk about how, it was like a channel thing or whatever, and they were talking
Mhm.
about how souls have these, the souls come in knowing that this is when they're going to go, and they're doing this for the collective, and they do it willingly.
Mhm. Mhm.
And they're not doing it at a conscious level, but it just is it's a nice, you know, and it's not to minimize the suffering of it, but it does feel like I can relax in it a little bit more in the understanding of where it's going and why, when I kind of broaden my energy field as being one, and move away from right and wrong and dualistic thinking.
Okay.
Yeah, because I just see a lot of people trapped in, they should be wearing masks, we shouldn't be closing our businesses down, and just all this kind of
Yeah.
A lot of suffering, a lot of resistance to the,
Yes.
and a lot of
Well, it's just a lot of fear.
yeah.
And fear of death, and fear of not knowing that they really are a spiritual essence that can't die.
Right.
You know, and most people don't have that sense of knowing.
Yeah.
And doesn't matter what you intellectualize about it. If
Right.
you have that sense, then you know you can't die, you don't age. But if you don't have that sense, or you haven't had that experience, or you don't have something that has allowed you to tap into that, either, you know, spiritual awakening, or sometimes near-death experiences where, you know, not near death, but people do die, but physiologically they die, and then they're brought back through paddles or recitation or some other forms. But they clearly have had the experience of what happens when they were dead, which was all kinds of things, but a common one is a light and family members and loved ones that are waiting. And that's been a pretty consistent,
Right.
you know,
Strong
experience for a lot of people that have had these experiences when the physiology, when they will become aware that they're not their physical bodies.
I mean,
And they have a clear sense of that. They just know, I am not my body.
Right. And that's documented in so many books and so many
thousands and thousands of ways. Yes.
And it's fascinating. And so I feel like, you know, it circles me back to this conversation that's really, I'm really passionate about. And it is, you know, educating the human species, youth, in a way where they can intelligently integrate their systems, their survival systems, and their higher self systems, and their higher wisdom, and giving them the tools to, you know, to be the gifts that they are, to be the wisdom that they are, and to you know, fully embrace the body and animal intelligence that they have.
Well, you know, you have to remember, one of the reasons people don't do that is you have to potentially go through a whole lot of muck. You know, as soon as you want to do, you know, people talk about they want to do their bliss, but I can tell you, the way to bliss takes you through hell.
Well, I think that's true when you're clearing karma.
Yes.
And I happen to think that there is potentially maybe an evolution of the species coming in with less collective karma.
Maybe.
And that's what it feels like to me, that I personally, that's a belief that's obviously debatable and whatever, but that we're moving towards some younger generations that come in with a little bit purer energy.
Well, hopefully some of the lessons we are learning are also being communicated, you know, through, you know, genetics and other things.
Right. So, I mean, I like to think at some point we don't have to experience abuse, rape, and trauma and mass murders. I feel like that's what those are there for, is to evolve our collective embodiment into a place of actually being in a place, like I said, where we're not creating our reality based on the traumas from our past, but that we've cleared that karma enough to where, and that's what I feel like this is. I feel like it's a massive clearing so that we can create that potential sort of more pure experience of creating from intention and a full integration of our body and higher self.
Okay.
I like to think that that's where we're moving collective species. Obviously, the timeline is very extended on that, but I feel like it's a major blip in that evolution.
Yeah,
it feels really big to me.
I agree. And I like that idea that there's an evolution, and there's a consciousness that's maturing and coming through, regardless of what we do or don't do. you know, if this is if we are just a part of a larger consciousness that just is always in the movement of expression and expanding and closing and quieting and dying and disappear. You know, we're in a possibility, it seems to me, of blossoming in our state of awareness that, you know, it's really exciting. And pandemic just reminds us that nature's in charge here. Relax.
Mm-hmm.
You know, we don't have to figure out how to beat nature. This is not a war. This just happens to be a part of nature that's coming through the system at the moment.
Mm-hmm.
And do you want to do it with as much wisdom and consciousness and generosity of heart and that you can? Yeah. But nonetheless, it's just, you know, it feels to me like it's a part of nature that has been here forever. In fact, I was listening to somebody the other day and we said, you know, human beings are basically built out of viruses and,
Right.
you know, and bacteria.
Right.
That
Yeah.
we, you know, from billions of years.
Right. Right.
You know, and these are not like some weird thing came through the country and said, oh, I'm going to kill a bunch of people.
Yeah.
This is like the essence of who we are. And some variation is coming by and reminding us of that.
Yeah, I feel like there's a calibration into some more emotional bodied and feminine energies. That's sort of recalibrating. And we talk about the earth and we talk about the compassion coming from a heart place. I feel those energies emerging as sort of a, you know, call it like a feminine emergence into recalibrating an imbalanced masculine dominant sort of society and culture and psychology we've been in to survive, legitimately to survive certain aspects of our evolution. And I feel like now is the time to create, like, I feel like there's this really great opportunity within the feminine energies. Like I see these sort of emerging feminine leaders and ways of leading from the heart that I've never seen before in my lifetime. And that feels really clear. My computer is going to die.
Okay, well, just to say that, you know, the truth is that, and without being sexist, is that the feminine does represent creating life.
Yeah.
And protecting life. And on the planet Earth, we need some protection of what we're doing to the life force on the planet.
Yeah, well, just
and the men have been going around pretty regularly,
right,
figuring out how to blow things up. We're good at it.
So masculine, feminine, I think of as energies. I think we all have masculine, feminine energies. I think we have masculine, feminine energies in Earth. You know, women embody masculine bodies and
absolutely,
and they want to be leaders right now, right? So to me, it's like, no,